China and Iran signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement in 2021 that quietly linked the world's largest energy importer with one of the most sanctioned energy producers on Earth. Most Western media treated it as another trade deal. In reality, that document reveals how Beijing plans to reshape the Middle East without deploying a single combat unit into the region. For decades, the strategic architecture of this part of the world revolved around American power. Washington built military bases across the Persian Gulf while guaranteeing the security of shipping lanes that carry enormous volumes of crude oil and liquefied natural gas. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet operates from Bahrain, specifically to protect maritime traffic passing through the Strait of Hormuz, which handles roughly a fifth of all oil traded by sea, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Because so much energy passes through that single corridor, the state that controls stability around it gains extraordinary geopolitical leverage. Beijing understands this equation better than most. China imports more crude oil than any other country on Earth, and a significant share arrives from Middle Eastern producers, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates. Iranian oil also reaches Chinese refineries despite Western sanctions, according to shipping analyses cited by both Reuters and Bloomberg. This means Beijing views the entire region through a strategic lens focused on secure energy flows, rather than ideological partnerships or military alliances. Iran fits into that calculation for reasons that go beyond oil. The country sits between Central Asia, the Persian Gulf, and the wider Indian Ocean, effectively positioning it along every corridor China hopes to connect through the Belt and Road Initiative. That massive infrastructure project aims to link Asia, Europe, and Africa through ports, railways, pipelines, and digital networks, which together form the backbone of Chinese trade strategy. Iranian territory sits at the intersection of multiple routes that could eventually move goods, energy, and industrial output across the entire Eurasian landmass. Geography alone does not explain why Beijing chose Tehran, though. Iran also faces severe Western sanctions that restrict access to global financial systems and limit energy exports to most markets. Those restrictions force Iranian leaders to seek Asian partners willing to trade, despite political pressure from Washington. China therefore gains leverage as one of the few major economies still purchasing Iranian crude and investing in infrastructure projects inside the country. Every sanction that isolates Tehran from Western capital simultaneously pushes it closer to Beijing. The cooperation framework between the two states reflects that dynamic precisely. Iranian officials describe the agreement as a broad roadmap covering energy, transportation, industrial development, and technology. Chinese authorities presented the deal more cautiously, yet confirmed it would deepen long-term economic ties. Analysts at the Atlantic Council and several regional think tanks note the agreement includes potential investment in Iranian transport infrastructure, ports, and energy facilities, although many specific provisions remain undisclosed. Energy sits at the foundation of everything. Iran holds the second largest natural gas reserves in the world, according to BP's statistical review, and ranks among the top holders of crude oil reserves globally. Access to those resources matters because Beijing must diversify supply chains across multiple regions to sustain industrial output. Reliance on a narrow group of exporters would expose China to devastating pressure in the event of conflict or coordinated sanctions from Western governments. Chinese strategists therefore pursue a diversification approach that spreads energy imports across Russia, Central Asia, Africa, and the Middle East simultaneously. Iranian oil fits neatly into that network, particularly because sanctions force Tehran to sell crude at discounted prices. Energy analytics firms such as Kepler report that a large share of Iranian shipments ultimately reach Chinese refineries, even when tankers travel under different flags or use intermediary trading companies. This arrangement lets Iran maintain revenue while giving Chinese buyers cheaper supply than market rates would normally allow. The discount dynamic creates a structural incentive that reinforces the partnership over time. As long as sanctions persist, Tehran needs buyers willing to absorb political risk alongside barrels of crude. Beijing fills that role while simultaneously reducing its average import cost per barrel compared to spot market purchases from Saudi Arabia or the Emirates. Analysts at Rystad Energy estimate that sanctioned Iranian crude often trades at significant discounts to Brent benchmark prices, meaning Chinese refiners gain a competitive edge on fuel costs that directly translates into lower manufacturing expenses across the industrial base. Military considerations also factor into Beijing's view of Iran, although the relationship remains far from a formal alliance. China has conducted limited naval exercises alongside Iran and Russia in the Gulf of Oman and the northern Indian Ocean over recent years. These drills focus on maritime security and anti-piracy operations rather than offensive combat training. Chinese defense officials present them as confidence-building measures designed to improve coordination during emergencies at sea. Even limited exercises carry symbolic weight because they signal Beijing's willingness to appear alongside states that challenge Western influence in the region. The drills also allow Chinese naval forces to gain operational familiarity with waters that are strategically vital for global trade. Around 90% of world commerce travels by sea, meaning protecting maritime routes has become central to Chinese security planning in ways that extend far beyond the Pacific. Beijing still avoids permanent military deployments inside Iran or any other Middle Eastern state. Chinese leaders consistently emphasize that their country does not pursue traditional military alliances. Instead, they describe partnerships built around economic development and mutual benefit, which contrasts sharply with the American model of formal security guarantees backed by large bases and forward-deployed troops. Strategic observers increasingly describe China's posture as a long-term influence campaign rather than a military expansion. Infrastructure projects, ports, industrial zones, and telecommunications networks create economic dependencies that gradually expand political leverage without triggering the kind of alarm that troop deployments generate. Once a regional government becomes economically tied to Chinese trade flows and financing, it naturally begins aligning diplomatically with Beijing on international issues. Iran illustrates how that dynamic unfolds in practice. Because Western sanctions restrict access to investment capital, Tehran actively seeks partners capable of funding major infrastructure upgrades. Chinese companies therefore gain opportunities to participate in railway construction, port modernization, and energy development. Those investments deepen interdependence, which strengthens political ties over time, while costing Beijing far less than maintaining a carrier strike group in the region. Long-term infrastructure planning reveals how China envisions Iran's role inside the broader Belt and Road network. Rail links connecting Western China through Central Asia toward the Middle East could eventually extend into Iranian ports on the Persian Gulf. From there, cargo might travel by ship to Africa or southern Europe, shortening transit times compared with traditional maritime routes around Southeast Asia. Pipeline projects represent another strategic dimension because energy corridors linking Iranian gas fields with neighboring states could theoretically connect with networks extending toward South Asia or even China's western provinces. Although many proposals remain conceptual, they highlight how geography positions Iran within a Eurasian transport architecture that Beijing is methodically constructing, one contract at a time. At the same time, China carefully balances its relationship with Iran against ties to other regional powers. Saudi Arabia remains one of Beijing's largest energy suppliers, while the UAE has become a major trading hub for Chinese goods. Israeli technology firms also cooperate with Chinese companies in sectors ranging from artificial intelligence to agricultural innovation. Maintaining working relationships with multiple rivals allows Beijing to position itself as a neutral economic partner rather than a geopolitical bloc leader. Diplomacy has become another instrument in this strategy. In 2023, Beijing hosted negotiations that restored diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia after years of hostility. The agreement surprised many observers because the two countries had previously relied on Iraq and Oman as mediators. Chinese officials framed the talks as proof that economic engagement can produce political stability, effectively advertising their model of influence to every government in the region watching from the sidelines. The mediation effort also demonstrated that Beijing could play a role in conflict management previously reserved for Washington, without deploying military forces or assuming security obligations that might draw China into future confrontations. Security analysts note that stability benefits Beijing's economic interests directly because energy shipments must pass through contested waters. That narrow choke point between Iran and Oman carries so much crude that any disruption would immediately ripple through global oil supply. Chinese shipping companies depend on those same sea lanes to deliver fuel to refineries along the eastern coastline, meaning instability in the Gulf threatens Chinese industrial output just as severely as it threatens European energy prices. Beijing therefore prefers an environment where tensions remain controlled rather than escalating into open confrontation. Chinese diplomats frequently call for restraint during crises involving Iran, Israel, or the United States. Public statements emphasize dialogue and sovereignty, which align with Beijing's long-standing principle of non-interference, while simultaneously building diplomatic capital across the region. Yet strategic calculations remain layered because China also benefits when American influence weakens. If regional governments begin questioning Washington's security guarantees, they inevitably diversify partnerships with other powers, including Beijing. Such shifts reshape the geopolitical landscape gradually, without requiring direct confrontation between China and the United States. Gulf monarchies already demonstrate this pattern by expanding economic ties with Beijing while maintaining military cooperation with Washington, essentially hedging their strategic bets across both poles of global power. Regional states monitor the China-Iran relationship carefully because shifting alliances influence security dynamics across the entire Gulf. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Qatar all maintain close defense partnerships with the United States, yet they simultaneously deepen trade links with China because Chinese demand drives global energy consumption. These governments recognize that alienating either Washington or Beijing would carry significant costs, so they cultivate relationships with both powers simultaneously. The result is an emerging multipolar environment where no single patron dominates and where economic leverage increasingly competes with military guarantees as the currency of influence. The United States retains unmatched military capabilities in the region, including advanced air bases, naval forces, and missile defense systems such as Patriot and THAAD batteries deployed across Gulf states. Israel continues developing layered interception networks, including Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow, which provide protection against a range of missile threats. Those security structures remain dominant today, meaning China's strategy does not replace American power in the near term. Instead, it operates alongside the existing system, while quietly expanding Beijing's political influence through economic corridors rather than military ones. Every pipeline, rail line, and energy contract redraws the strategic map incrementally. Iran sits at the center of that long timeline because its geography, resources, and political isolation combine to create precisely the kind of opportunity Beijing's patient strategy is designed to exploit. Global power rarely shifts through dramatic confrontation alone. More often, it moves through incremental changes that accumulate until a new balance becomes visible. The partnership between China and Iran follows exactly that pattern, where no fleets cross oceans and no armies occupy foreign capitals. Yet the architecture of influence across the Middle East transforms with every infrastructure agreement signed behind closed doors.